Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm coming to you live from Madrid, Spain, at the castle built by Philip II in the 16th century. This morning, our topics take us to the thought of David Hume and Edmund Burke. Both of these 18th century thinkers resist ideological names attached to their thinking. Hume has been called both a conservative and a liberal, and Edmund Burke as well. So, over the next 75 minutes, what I'll try to do is establish the principal characteristics that are part of David Hume's body of work and contrast and compare that body of work with that of Edmund Burke. In our class so far, we have ventured into different countries. With Machiavelli, we started in Italy with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Harrington. We're in England. Then we journeyed to France with Montesquieu, and this morning we are back in the British Isles, but in Scotland this time with David Hume, before moving on to Ireland in the case of Edmund Burke. David Hume is somewhat of a paradox in the pantheon of 18th century thinkers, certainly associated with the Enlightenment, but a paradox in the sense that Hume founded no school of thought that was enduring. Hume left no successor. It was considered, in fact, in the time of Hume, somewhat dangerous to follow in Hume's footsteps, at least his thinking footsteps. The irony in the case of David Hume is that he was not a tremendously popular figure in the 18th century, and was rediscovered in our own time, in the 20th and 21st century, when his appeal to the emotional understanding that is part of the human condition found a wide audience in both Europe and in the United States. Hume was born in 1711 and suffered from a very early age what many of you probably suffered as well at one point in time. It's what we call teenage angst. In Spanish, I call it pánico juvenil. Hume was a bold thinker and resisted authority. He himself once said that submitting to authority is not something that I'm prone to do. He was a curious mind, an avid reader, and set about discovering what he called a new medium by which truth might be established. This is a concern, of course, of the Age of Reason, going back into the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. By the time we reach the Enlightenment, we are at a high point in the concern for finding out the truth, what is the truth, and then establishing true knowledge as a result. This led Hume into different libraries around his hometown of Edinburgh in Scotland, and led him into a life of reading that eventually came to unsettle his mind. His reading led him into depression. His reading led him into hypochondria. He even consulted a doctor at one point, and the doctor told him that there really wasn't anything wrong with him. He just had the disease of learning. Hume made most of his original thinking, his original contribution to philosophical thought, before he reached the age of 30. That is what a curious mind will do for you. In 1739, before his 30th birthday, he published a treatise of human nature. As Hume himself said, this was an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. Now, a word here is necessary about what moral subjects were considered to be at this time. We're not talking about the study of pure ethics or morality in this case. Moral theory in the time of Hume, in the time of Adam Smith, in the time of Edmund Burke, were considered to be those topics of wide-ranging human, the wider-ranging human condition, let's say. It might include marriage. It might include international relations. It would include political economy. It would include a whole host of things which, in our time, have become specializations, and so the term moral theory is no longer used in the sense that it was in the time of David Hume. Hume is interested then in understanding the human mind. He's interested in establishing a new medium that will allow him to apply a method of discovery that is universal to the human condition. You might be asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with politics? And Hume is going to answer that question by saying that politics is essentially about the passion of humankind. Hume is famous for a number of different sayings, but probably one of his most famous is that man is a slave to his passions. Hume's attempt here, then, in developing an experimental method of reasoning is to get beyond the passions of the human existence and discover the true seedbed of what we believe, what we think. We're talking here about something that's called in philosophy epistemology. This is a word you're going to come across, if you haven't already, when we broach subjects among these different thinkers we're considering in this class. The word is of Greek origin. Epistemology, put simply, refers to the idea, or tries to answer the question, we might say, how do we know what we know? What happens within the human mind that allows us to know something? And how do we know that that something is actually true, actually real? These subjects, these topics, again, you might be saying to yourself, seem fairly metaphysical and somewhat abstract, beyond the capacity of the establishment of verifiable truth. But Hume, at this point, has become a critic of traditional thinking, scholastic thinking, revealed truth, which he considers to be dogma, and has undertaken at this point an assault on what he considers decayed systems of thought. And this assault is within the traditions of the Enlightenment period, which is attacking the existing systems of thought. Well, you might ask, what is the reaction once Hume publishes this book before his 30th birthday, a treatise of human nature? And I would have to say, as many said at the time, the reaction was not good. A number of adjectives come to mind. I can quote some said once the book was published. It was called paradoxical. It was called callow, a word you might not know. It was called immoral. It was called heathen, which could be translated as either savage or pagan. It was called dogmatic. It wasn't received well, in other words. And this left Hume somewhat depressed. The reason for his depression, of course, was that what he had set out to prove, that there was a way to develop a method for discovering the truths of the human condition. And at long last, after he had gone through the entire exercise, he became increasingly skeptical about his findings and reached a conclusion that was entirely in opposition to his original objective. If there is one word in the English vocabulary that applies to David Hume, that word might be skepticism. Hume is associated with what is called the skeptical Enlightenment. And this week and next, as we did a little last week with Montesquieu, we need to talk a little bit more about what the Enlightenment was. And as you might suspect, there was no one universal European Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had different tones, it had different emphasis, it had different thinkers in different parts of the European continent and the British Isles, and different spokesmen for these different currents of the Enlightenment. The principal spokesman for what's called the skeptical Enlightenment is David Hume. If we look for his opposing representative within the Enlightenment, we would probably point to Voltaire in France. Voltaire is usually associated with something called the radical Enlightenment. And next week, I'll get into more detail about exactly what that means. There was even something called the moderate Enlightenment, which was a halfway house between the radical and the skeptical Enlightenment that I've just mentioned. The best representative of the moderate Enlightenment, as I pointed out last week, would be Montesquieu. So where does the skepticism of David Hume come from? This is the question that ultimately we need to address. And I will recall for you an English thinker that I mentioned early on in our classes, and that is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, who lived in the late 16th and early 17th century, is a figure associated with the scientific revolution. And I even quoted to you something about his conclusions that for him also limited the human ability to reach definitive conclusions about human existence. There is a skepticism in Francis Bacon, but Bacon's skepticism is limited to the scientific method, limited to the natural sciences. By the time we get to Hume, who is then 130, 140 years later when he publishes this treatise that I've just mentioned, there has been movement, intellectual movement. There has been an effort to take the scientific method which was applied in the 17th century to science exclusively, to the natural sciences, to what we call today astronomy or chemistry or even mathematics. There is a mathematical revolution between the 16th and the 18th century. We've already seen in Hobbes how geometry is a force present in his philosophical contribution, in his method of argumentation. The change that has occurred has taken skepticism applied in the natural sciences and moved it into the arena of what today we call the social sciences, what today we call the human sciences. By that I mean anthropology, I mean sociology, I mean economics. There are a number of social sciences that must deal with man himself and his perception of reality as a variable. And the effort that Hume made to make that variable prone to scientific principles is what ultimately caused his frustration. Francis Bacon began this tradition of skepticism in a book published in the 1620s. In Latin, in those days, everything was published, Novum Organum. And this book by Francis Bacon, Novum Organum, is essentially the foundational document of the scientific method as it becomes known over the next 2 to 3 centuries. It is a method that requires experimentation, the creation of categories, the replication of designed experiments. These produce a result which should be replicated if the same method is followed by anyone else who is investigating this scientific area in another country at another time. It is literally an effort to make universal the cause and effect that occurs in science. When Bacon is asked, or when Bacon, I should say, decides to speak about human understanding as something prone to this same kind of scientific method, he makes a very famous observation. I began to quote it to you, as I said, in a prior class. Human understanding resembles not a dry light, but admits a tincture of the will and passions which generate their own system accordingly. For man always believes more readily that which he prefers to believe. In short, his feelings imbue and corrupt his understanding in innumerable ways, and sometimes ways that are imperceptible. This is slide 2 that we have quoting Francis Bacon and his Novum Organum. What has Bacon said here? If you are an English speaker with a wide-ranging vocabulary and can decipher these very difficult, sometimes abstract concepts, what you'll find in this phrase, which you see up there, is the same thing that Hume ultimately discovered in his journey to establish a scientific method for understanding or explaining the human condition. At the end of his journey that led to the publication of this first great work of his, he reached a level of frustration that led him into an entirely skeptical existence from then on. And at that point, then, David Hume assumes the mantle of a representative, if not the representative, of the skeptical Enlightenment. Slide 3, then, resumes, or in short, makes reference to where this experimental method of reasoning came from and how it got to Hume by way of Francis Bacon, by way of Sir Isaac Newton, the effort to abandon scholastic thinking, and the scientific drive to establish cause and effect. And this needs to be spoken of a little bit, because it's still today essentially what drives the technocratic mind in the social sciences. When you are asked to research something, do an investigation, you might apply these same principles to the investigative work you're doing for this class on your modern thinker. You might reach a point where you are tempted to draw conclusions that are based on cause and effect. This thinker reaches these principles because of something that happened in his earlier life, in his earlier reading, in his investigation, in his thought process. This is what Hume is trying to uncover. Hume's greatest disappointment then is when he reaches the conclusion that when it comes to human activities, the ability of the human being to extract predictable and permanent effects is a very incomplete and very frustrating exercise. Cause and effect, then, for David Hume becomes something in which, in science, we must be skeptical of. In the investigation of the human condition, even more so. The effort by Hume then to establish a science of ethics is pretty much referred to there, as you see in the slide. We can read it. What if in the operations of the mind and heart there were some connecting principle? That's what Hume is looking for. A sort of law of gravity in humanity. A law of gravity, something that is eternally true. What goes up must come down. Not only in humanity, in history, in law, in political economy. A single law that plausibly explained the chaos of human phenomena for all time. That's his objective, and that is also his failure. Once you start applying scientific principles to those areas of human existence, like history, like economics, like public choice, like sociology, like law, like politics, it is impossible to make these human activities scientific endeavors. Science must be applied in those spheres of existence that are beyond man, that exist in the natural world, and that have discoverable principles that make them work. The laws of thermodynamics, the laws of gravity, the laws of astrophysics. These kinds of laws, which are scientific, that allow prediction, that are replicable, can be repeated in different experiments, are not something that can be applied to the existence of humankind. So Hume's argument that the basis of all knowledge is causation collapses. And as a result, Hume falls into that state of skepticism which characterized him for the rest of his life. In the next slide, then, Hume says, all probable reasoning is nothing but a species of sensation. So, in that sense, Hume is part of an 18th century philosophical movement or school of thought and perception called sensism, sensismo in Spanish. When I am convinced of any principle, I am only convinced of an idea, which strikes more strongly on me because of my sense of it than it might on somebody else. When I give the preference to one set of arguments that confirm that sensation, I do nothing but decide on the basis of feeling. Feelings concerning the superiority of the influence of my senses. That is the essence of Hume's journey towards skepticism. Starting out with the belief that scientific method yields truth, he was unable to extend scientific method to the human condition, and so the study of the human condition and all of those areas of human endeavor that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago does not necessarily produce truth. And so Hume ends up with the conviction that belief is never rational. Since we know nothing, we simply believe we know. This last quote from Hume sort of sums up where his final intellectual journey will leave him. We perceive only the end, the final point of a process, the will to initiate and the movement that follows. If we think we see a direct causal connection among them, well, we are mistaken. Hume's argument pretends conclusiveness on the question of causality then. And even if it fails, or even if it falls short and fails, it does show the precipitousness with which we suppose that we understand and perceive things as they really are. Cause and effect, a very difficult proposition to prove when it comes to the human variable. If the human mind, if human interests, if human beliefs are part of the equation, then for Hume, it is impossible to speak of cause and effect. So, what are we left with here? This leaves 18th century Scotland, the intellectual environment of Edinburgh, tremendously unsettled. Hume is pointing out what might be called an inconvenient truth for the Enlightenment thinkers who are convinced of the possibility of maintaining not only the primacy of religious thinking at this time, but the radical thoughts present in Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and others who, on the margins of Scottish society, follow the French Enlightenment. We have in Scotland in the 18th century a wide-ranging Enlightenment, which in the study, the historical study of the Enlightenment, is called specifically the Scottish Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment is presented as something akin but different to the English Enlightenment. Again, different enlightenments. The Scottish Enlightenment, akin but really different from the Continental Enlightenment, from the French Enlightenment. In the case of the Scottish Enlightenment, what we have is an intellectual effort to overcome the prejudices, the Inquisition-like activities of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. We must remember the historical context in which Scotland achieved its religious Protestantism in the 16th century, and that context is directly associated with Calvinist thought. Jean Calvin in French, I think, if I recall correctly, was even offered as one of the possible thinkers you might choose to investigate, because Calvin's thought has political ramifications. That's why he's among the political thinkers. The political ramification of Calvinist thought is its republicanism. And since we spent more than one class speaking about republicanism, and we will continue to hear about republicanism as we move through the 18th and into the 19th century, let's recall that one of the founding principles, baseline principles of republicanism is not just the separation of powers, but the dispersal of decision-making. There are different authorities present in a process of deciding. Usually these are councils, they are commissions, they are executive bodies, they are legislative or simply assemblies that gather to represent different parts of a political body. The Republican idea is the idea that there is not one final authority. This was the opposition, you remember, that Hobbes stated about republicanism. Republicanism divides sovereignty, and Hobbes is against sovereignty's division. Calvin created a church that was run by two different councils, a council of elders and a council of ministers. In the original model that Calvin created and helped spread to other parts of Europe, to Holland, to Prussia, to parts of France, and to Scotland in the 1560s, that spread produced in Scotland the only Calvinist national church. Calvinism was the religion of the cities, of the middle classes, of the bourgeoisie. So when you go to Scotland and you find that you have the only Calvinist church which becomes a national church, displacing the national Catholic Church which had existed before. And this national church, Calvinist, called Presbyterian in Scotland, probably in part because of its national character, becomes overarching, overbearing, overwhelming for a lot of Scottish people, because it takes on a rather narrow interpretation of Calvinism. When we get to the 18th century, 150 years later, Hume, 150 years after Calvinism comes to the Scottish people, to the middle classes, and in Scotland, it is a national religion to the extent that it was most attractive to the professional and the productive and the commercial and the industrial middle classes of Scotland. The nobility in Scotland continued to be Catholic. The royalty in Scotland, of course, ultimately left for exile in France, but continued to be Catholic. The lower orders of the Scottish clans in the Highlands also continued to be Catholic. But the vast majority of the Scottish people came to Calvinism in the late 17th century and accepted this national church, which, as I was saying, ultimately became overbearing, intrusive, even to the extent which Calvinism allows in its doctrines, of invading the private space of families, of individuals. The Calvinism of 18th century Scotland, then, 150 years after its founding, has become an establishment. It has become conservative. It has become invasive. It has become an impeding force for many ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment. And Hume, among others, is well aware of this. And Hume is resisting this. And Hume is actually undermining it with his intellectual contribution. Hume, in this book on the human, the acquisition, the epistemological way, the epistemological interpretation of how we understand, how is it that we really know what we know, is a very questioning, skeptical, as we've said, way of going about presenting ideas openly in what is still, and when Hume publishes his first book, we're still in the first half of the 18th century, still a very closed-minded society. And that's one of the reasons why, as I read before, the book fell on not just deaf ears, but ears that couldn't be opened up to the kind of skepticism that Hume was offering. Hume, in many senses, is far ahead of his time in terms of a liberal who expects to be accepted in his free thinking. And perhaps that is the liberal bend to Hume, not to say that there aren't others that make him more conservative. This 18th century Scottish Enlightenment, then, which will ultimately produce an industrial revolution, will ultimately produce the works of Adam Ferguson, the works of Adam Smith, the works of many other figures associated with Scotland in the second half of the 18th century, is unable in the first half of the 18th century to find fertile ground for the reception of such skeptical thinking. So in this sense, Hume is a revolutionary thinker. On the one hand, the consequences of the Humean thought process leads one necessarily to deny the idea of a God, religious convictions, ideas that are founded on belief systems in general. So, in that sense, Hume is an opponent of Locke. Hume is an opponent of natural rights theory. For Hume, there's no such thing as natural rights. For Hume, there's no such thing as a social contract. In one of his essays, called Of the Social Contract, Hume destroys the entire philosophical underpinnings of Locke's political presentation of man in natural society getting together and establishing a contract, a social contract for coordinated, cooperating human action. This, for Hume, is bunk, because for Hume, there's no evidence. Nothing exists in human history that proves or that shows human society gets together and makes a social contract for their bonding together and prospering. Hume looks at history with a cold eye, and that cold eye sees that in human society, you become part of a political community, usually through violence, through conquest, through war. Hume finds no examples in the history of the British Isles, and he writes a 5-volume history of England and Britain, which has just formed itself shortly before Hume was born, the Union of Scotland and England. So, the idea that there is natural rights, that these rights are self-evident, that truths can be self-evident, it has been pointed out many times that what is self-evident to me may not necessarily be self-evident to you. So Hume is, I would have to say, more in the liberal tradition of Hobbes, that nature equips each individual with a capacity for judgment, with a capacity to project the consequence of his actions. You remember that phrase from when we talked about how Hobbes understood human nature. But although nature gives each individual what he calls faculty of mind, capacity, ability, to project the consequences of action, that does not mean that nature provides man with a solid faculty of mind, a capacity to find truth. This rubbed many people the wrong way, of course, because as the critics of Hume ultimately point out, the consequence of this line of thought leads you into the position that, well, one set of conclusions is not necessarily better than another set of conclusions. I don't know if that's a fair criticism of Hume, but it is a criticism of Hume. Hume can lead you down the road of relativity and lead you to believe that, well, as I just said, one set of conclusions is just as good as another. And that's not what Hume is saying, essentially. He is saying that human beings have a natural ability, a cognitive ability, to distinguish and establish consequences of actions, and a moral judgment must be projected over what those consequences might be. But that doesn't mean that we can necessarily attach the word truth to what one person perceives as the consequences in his faculty of mind as compared to a different faculty of mind that might perceive a different truth. So for Hume, what we call truth is inclination. Remember, we're talking about those soft, bland sciences, what we call the social sciences. Truth in the natural science for Hume, yes, may exist, probably does. Hume is speaking specifically about the human condition, the soft sciences, laws of history, laws of economics, laws of sociology, come and go according to the conventional wisdom of the time. Come and go according to the socialization process through which you have filtered your being, your growth, your maturation. Come and go along with exposure to only one set of criteria in the absence of exposure to another set of criteria. This is then the essence of Humean skepticism. We're on the last slide now where we speak of the revolutionary Hume. Hume says, you can see there in the middle of the page, this is the last quote we'll have from him. All our reasoning concerning causes and effects are derived from nothing but custom. And that belief is more properly an act of the sensitive mind. Again, sensismo, perception. Our truths form as a result of how we perceive. More an act of the sensitive mind than of the cognitive thinking part of our nature. When I give the preference to one set of arguments over another set of arguments, I do nothing but decide on the basis of my feeling, of my belief concerning the superiority of the influence of those arguments and of my preferences. Okay, so we reach the bottom there of this final slide on Hume before we move on to Burke. Summing up, there is science no longer, at least in the human area of existence. The social science humanities. There is futility in really trying to know something, to know that it's true. There, once again, epistemology. There are no laws of nature. Locke's social contract, as I stated, a fraud. Smith's supply and demand, and this will come as unhappy conclusion for classical liberalism, a fiction. Supply and demand is a belief. Supply and demand is an ideal. Supply and demand has no historical evidence. It can be presented as a principle, but when has it really ever existed following those laws of supply and demand? This is odd, in fact, because Hume and Smith are very close friends. They know each other from the intellectual circles. They correspond. They socialize. They're very different kinds of characters. Hume is very sociable, ultimately, in life, whereas Smith is more reserved and retiring. And Hume, and here we have, what I would say is the principal objection to including Hume among liberal or Whig thinkers of the 18th century. Hume is a very ardent critic of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. and in his essays, Moral and Political, which should be read, I think, for anyone who wants to understand Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment. In that collection of essays, again, the same essay on the social contract, where he destroys Locke's argument, says that the 1688 revolution, what we call the glorious or the bloodless revolution, is a power grab by a minority of new elites, Whig elites. And he goes on to say that this decision was made by a body of people that numbered in the thousands and in no way represents a contract with the English people. So we'll leave David Hume right there and move on to a comparison and a contrast with Edmund Burke. There are then only two more slides. This will be the first slide on Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, you can see, was born almost 2 decades after David Hume, 18 years, so he's a younger man, Edmund Burke. Lives until 1797, has a longer life than David Hume, and almost makes it into the 19th century. Edmund Burke then saw most of the controversy, most of the warfare, most of the rise of England to its position as the preeminent naval power in the world, in Europe, and had, in contrast to David Hume, a political career. So in David Hume, we have someone who, because of his skepticism, because of his denial of Presbyterian dogma, Calvinist dogma, religious thought in general, did make him somewhat of a pariah in local Scottish society, in Edinburgh society. Retired then in his later years into someone who socialized and cooked for his fellow intellectuals and went out to what we call pubs in the English tradition and engaged openly with thinking people in Edinburgh society, but he was never accepted by high society. He was unable to be appointed a position as a lecturer, as a professor of the university, because of the thoughts that he maintained. He was always suspect, always thought, many thought that he was an atheist. And this is not something that you could easily get away with in 18th century Edinburgh or Scottish society in general. So the idea that Hume would have a political or even a professorial career like Adam Smith is not something that was possible for him. Edmund Burke, on the other hand, becomes one of the key actors in the British Parliament from the 1760s on, oddly enough, representing as an Irishman an English district that elected him. So, Burke is an Irishman. Burke is a Catholic. Burke is born in Dublin. Burke, nevertheless, is the product of one of those rare Irish families where you have one parent an Anglican, another parent a Catholic, and who sends their children to educational facilities that are not breeding intolerance, religious intolerance, into the school children. So Burke has an opportunity to educate himself in a conservative environment, we'd have to say, but not an intolerant conservative environment. Burke has the opportunity to move on to British society, London society, after mid-century, where he becomes associated with who were known as the Rockingham Liberals, the Earl of Rockingham being one of the pillars of English politics at this time. Whig politics, it should be said. And so Burke gravitates toward this group who reward him with a seat in one of the districts that today we would say are controlled, and I suppose that's not an entirely inappropriate term to use, by the Rockingham, controlled by the Rockingham Liberals, the Rockingham Whigs, I should say. Liberals, not a term used at this time. So you have in Edmund Burke, by the 1760s, someone who also becomes resistant to political name tags. In Hume, we see that he has Whiggish tendencies, he has Tory tendencies. Hume, however, would reject any name tag whatsoever. There's no such thing as a political party to which a person like David Hume could belong. Nevertheless, he recognizes the existence of political parties which are forming for the first time in the first half of 18th century Great Britain. Burke, by the same token, and I might even forewarn you that you probably will come across in your studies, in your listening to different perspectives, different professors, different conferences. And it may strike you as odd that you hear Burke presented as a liberal, as some here at this university do, or presented as a conservative. And it's only natural to find this confusing. I, however, will follow the thoughts of the dean of conservative study, academics in 20th century North America, and this is Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk wrote a classic book called The Idea of Conservatism, and we read some of this book in my class on ideologies. And in the very introduction of the book, first chapter, Kirk defines the characteristics of conservative thinking. And let's make sure we understand that Kirk is talking about conscious conservatism. In other words, being a conservative and being aware of your conservativeness, what it means to be a conservative in a political, in a social, even in an economic sense, if you like. And in this introduction to his book, he outlines a number of characteristics that conservatives have. I'm going to read briefly what these characteristics are, and I'll ask you, as I read them, to ask yourselves whether the thought, the character content in these beliefs is conservative or liberal. 1. Conservatives believe in a transcendent order, in a body of natural law. There we have a contrast with Hume. Hume spoke against, even intellectually destroyed, the idea of natural rights, natural law. Burke? No, the opposite. Belief in a transcendent order or body of natural law. This body of natural law rules society, sets the norms. We take our conscience, better said, from these rules of natural law. So, political problems in this sense are at bottom essentially religious or moral problems, not like Machiavelli thought that they are problems practical and need resolution with crude realism and the following of interests. So, there's an idea, conservative, and yet that idea has probably been introduced to you, maybe in a different class, in a different reading, as a liberal idea. And so you see the basis for the confusion when it comes to seeing Burke as a conservative or as a liberal. Second characteristic, I said there were 6, this is only 2. Second characteristic, conservatives have a feeling and affection, in other words, a warm feeling toward the mysteries of human existence. Human existence is a mystery, and as such, conservatives are against the idea of narrowing or imposing on that mystery rational Enlightenment kind of thinking. We may talk next week about how the Enlightenment openly attacks ecclesiastical interpretations and miracles and superstitions, so-called, by enlightened thinkers. Conservatives then resist what one student of conservatism called logicalism, the idea that something is logical. Well, miracles are not logical. The marvelousness of human existence is not necessarily logical. It's something that you find, come across. There is a certain mysticism, only a certain mysticism, in conservatism. To what extent you find that in liberalism is, again, a question that needs to be considered. This third characteristic, however, is clearly a dividing line between liberalism and conservatism. And this third item, according to Russell Kirk, is the conviction, the belief, the solid belief that any civilized society requires orders and classes, is the phrase, but you have to understand orders in its pre-20th, 19th century, pre-revolutionary France, estate-organized society where there are different ranks. Rank is the same thing as order. A rank is a level, is a status. It is where you are in the different levels of society. Your rank, your order, it's the same thing. I belong to this order. It's like a monastic order. You belong to a monastic order, but it's an order because it makes, it endows you with a certain rank in society through which you refer to yourselves and others refer to you. Said another way, conservatives are against the modern Marxist establishment of classes based on wealth, based on income, based on profession. Conservatives are entirely comfortable with hierarchies then. The belief that there are natural orders in society from top to bottom. A body politic is also a hierarchical arrangement. There are people at the top and there are more people at the bottom, and they are arranged so in such a way that there is more privilege accrued, there is more welfare, a better material existence is naturally accepted at the higher end of this kind of hierarchy than at the lower. Conservatives see this as something natural, and Burke is a believer in hierarchical arrangements in society. There are people who are at the top, and there are people who are at the bottom, and there are people who are in the middle, and that's the way society is, because that's the way society has always been. Now that is not a very liberal idea, to be honest. Liberals are consecrated to the idea of equality. Equality in the sense of my legal, civic, political condition before the state. I have the same kind of civil rights as anybody else. I have a reasonable expectation to be treated with the same kind of justice as everyone else. But that is not true in hierarchical civil society, conservative society, I mean to say. Now, in this fourth characteristic, you'll find something that is entirely in keeping with liberal thinking. Conservatives are convinced, persuaded, that freedom and property are closely linked. Well, I don't need to say anything more. That's an entirely consistent idea with classical liberalism. Unless freedom and property are closely linked, Leviathan, Hobbes's Leviathan, is hovering over our existence. Again, entirely consistent with liberal thinking. On the other hand, this fifth characteristic, faith in prescription. What does that mean? It means that we look to the way things have always been done in our social, political, historical existence. The past prescribes what we do in the present, which prescribes what we do in the future. Burke is known as a philosopher who strongly believes in a prescriptive constitution. And a prescriptive constitution is a constitution that is not necessarily written down. It is the accumulated customs, expectations, patterns of conduct, how we get together in society to solve our problems, what the norms are, how shame should be felt and used as a limiting force in human behavior. All of these things that were part of a traditional society should be part of the present society and should instruct this society on how to move into the future. So, prescription, custom, convention, these are the checks on the anarchic, chaotic impulses of man. And finally, in this set of 6, the recognition that change, for the sake of change, is not necessarily good, or in 18th century terms, salutary. Change is necessary, but it should be prudent change. Change is necessary, but it must be directed by the virtues of the past. So, I think it's important to emphasize that the conservatism of Edmund Burke is not a conservatism that denies outright change. The phrase made famous by Burke is, change should preserve continuity. Burke also says that a society that has no mechanism or ability to change is a society destined to pass out of existence, to die off. So change is necessary in the conservative thinking of Burke, but it's prudent change. And the definition of prudence is moderation, virtue, consideration of the past, and how it will affect the bonds of the human community. In conservatism, it's the community itself that is important. And if we go to the last slide on Burke, which speaks of his venture into politics, you can see that those points I've made in the box in the center is what we've just discussed. Burke has an idea of the importance of political parties, and this contrasts as well with David Hume's idea. Hume is not convinced that political parties are necessarily an undertaking that will produce political movement, that are necessary to political movement. Hume is skeptical, and so he is skeptical about what politics can achieve. He sees political parties as factions of men gathering together to promote their own interest. Burke has a different idea. The distinction is important. In Burke, political parties, political factions, as they were called in those days, are bodies of men who, yes, get together united by a vision for the country and perhaps similar interests, but they work for the common good. And this is a conservative idea as well, that the common good of the nation, the whole nation, is something that political parties must work towards. Now, I'll be quick to add that that's an idea also of liberal thought as well. At the bottom of our last slide, then, there's a reference to, after continuity and change, the idea of Burke, his most important work, or what many consider to be his most important work, which is his reflections on the Revolution in France. And it was the French Revolution that exercised Burke's mind most of all at the end of his life. He saw the French Revolution as an experiment in perfecting the nature of man, and perfecting the nature of man in conservative thought is considered a very dicey, a very unhealthy proposition. And so Burke is the ideologue of the counter-revolution, of the critique of what those values we associate with the French Revolution were, and he continued to be that on into the 19th century, and continues to be so today. Burke is still read for his critique of the French Revolution. So, we will leave our considerations of Hume and Burke there, and next week move on to Rousseau, with whom we will be able to look more closely at the counter-Enlightenment and the French Revolution itself. Have a good week.